Okay, so when did you start painting?
Started painting, I mean, with oils or?
Period. What was the first time you picked up a brush?
Well, actually, before brush, I remember, growing up in Canada and grew up in Edmonton, Northwest Canada.
Yeah.
It's snowing outside today, which will be an inconvenience here for a couple days, but in Canada, it's like the snow starts pretty much in October and stays till April sometimes, where we grew up. Yeah, so long winters. Edmonton, Northwest.
Okay.
So really far north, and a lot of just bored winter afternoons, and especially as kids, like, Mom, what can I do? I'm bored. And I remember she did encourage me to do art, and so I was drawing and doing very complex, drawings of like battles and all kinds of stuff. And then one day she gave me finger paints, and so I was just working with finger paints before I even like ever picked up a brush. But I didn't, it's funny because I get messy, but like ever since I was young, I don't like having
paint on your fingers.
Yeah, like I don't like having like greasy hands or anything, so I wash my hands like obsessively. But so pretty quickly, I think I started experimenting with brushes with the finger paints, and then I think she bought me a watercolor set or something like that. But my father had always dabbled in oil painting and landscapes, and so he started taking me to a painting class when I was about 8 or 9 years old, and they started me off using pastels and just drawing, and then I believe the first time I ever used oils, I think I was 10. My first ever painting was of a horse's head for some reason, which my parents still have at their house, actually. And I looked at it a couple of years ago. It wasn't too bad.
It was
for like a 10-year-old kid, painting with oils. I got a little rebellious at one point, and I was like, I don't want to paint anymore, which I regret. So a couple years went by. I think from maybe the age of like 12 to 14 or 15, I didn't paint. And then I got back into it in high school at about 15 years old, and been painting ever since then. Yeah.
So what were you painting mostly in high school?
High school was a little bit of everything, but typical like high school student stuff. Well, I think it was like musicians and some landscapes, and a lot of it is trying to understand the medium and trying to figure out like how paint works. And so I think that the concepts and the imagery was a little bit secondary. Or in retrospect, probably at the time I was very determined to do a portrait of. I think I remember. I was trying to do a portrait of Jim Morrison of the Doors, and I remember that band, and I was so like, I got to get this right. But the paint was an obstacle. So from a pretty young age, and then I did paint throughout school. I had some great instructors along the way. I think even once I got out of grad school in New York, there was still a lot to discover on my own though. And I ended up doing a lot of illustration work, and like just commercial stuff. I actually used to do sometimes the cover of the Village Voice newspaper. I used to work for hip hop magazines. I did illustrations for The Source and for XXL back in the day, and Vibe magazine, things like that. I think I did something for Vibe. It's so long ago. But I was cranking a lot and really doing a lot of portraiture and a lot of painting, and just the repetition and the sort of nonstop painting helped me figure out a lot. So it's kind of that 10,000 hours
of
thing,
learning.
Of just being, sink or swim. And so that's where I think I got, I got better fairly quickly, just because I was painting all the time getting out of school. But I'm still discovering things.
Was your gift of illustration inherited, or are you the first of your family to properly capture exactly what something looks like?
Well, I mean, the illustration part of things is more like when you are given a story and you create an image to go with that story and sort of connect those two things. So that's a little bit more commercial minded, but just in terms of rendering the figure or depicting the figure, I guess I was probably, my father was doing more landscapes and things, but he could draw, but I think it's something that he didn't give himself the opportunity to really explore.
Okay.
You know, he's very practical minded, and as I mentioned, his family was, you know, coming from a tough background, you know, having been, you know, put in a Japanese internment camp. And so when they got out, they had a very practical mindset, and the whole family, he came from a family of 7 brothers and sisters, and they all had to just, after school, go out and work. Yeah, because my grandfather had a farm afterwards. Well, it was basically a plot of land they gave them, and they had sort of to build up from nothing, you know? Yeah. So I think his artistic pursuits were sort of backburnered, and but he certainly had talent, and I think that's something that inspired me probably when I was young, is to see my dad draw a little bit, paint a bit. But yeah, I think I was really the first, certainly in the family, to really go this far and be committed, you know, to creating paintings of figures. And yeah, as I said, you know, still a learning process. You know, that's I think that's important though. You know, any artist that I admire is, they've said the same thing, like, till the day you die, you're still developing and still working and still trying to figure out things. And that's the case with me, certainly. Who is Tim in 2020? Okay, that's a very challenging question for me to start off with. Well, I've got about 4 or 5 new series in mind. I think that for me, a big part of my thinking right now, entering the new year, is change, transition, and some metamorphosis that's not going to be completely unfamiliar to what I've done before, but it's certainly going to build on some things that I think were a little more straightforward in a way, in terms of creating imagery, in terms of transmitting ideas. I'm going to get a little bit more, I guess, a little more outside of my comfort zone in terms of how I'm putting images together, and also in terms of symbolism, and exploring some areas that for me I haven't touched on in a long time. You know, one of those is working with the male figure. I've been working with you know, depicting women, and in most cases women of color, for about 20 years now. So coming back to getting reacquainted with the male figure is an interesting shift for me also.
Why the woman figure more so than the male?
You know, it started very organically with just me meeting and becoming good friends here in New York. I moved here in '91 with just meeting and really like discovering some great stories of friends of mine, and just sort of having them pose, you know, without thinking too much about where that was going to go, you know, big picture. And once I got into a couple of portraits, I realized, wow, like there's so much here, and there's really also such a lack of representation of those stories, and of you know, the figure in sort of a more realist academic way. You know, in museums you don't see portraits, you know, of women of color very often, and if you do, their role is it's in the wrong time period. Absolutely, and wrong attitudes, you know, in a lot of cases. So that's where I realized that there was so much more to delve into, and it went from being this more sort of organic, like just gut instinct thing, to it felt like a calling, you know, to get deeper and deeper into it, and to understand, you know, how to, or try to understand how to capture, you know, as best I could, some of those stories on canvas. And there was almost a responsibility that I felt to keep going for a long time, you know.
What are some challenges, like, do you think that you face when trying to capture this body of a woman of color, and showing how she could be full of strength, but also show the struggle of societal issues?
Yeah, I think some of the struggle things were kind of inherent, you know, just. In what way? I think I wasn't trying to like overtly paint that part of the story, but I think that just psychological, some of the subtleties, and some of the, in some cases, it depends on the individual. There's no sweeping generalizations I can make, but I think some people had a little bit of a look that was a little bit world weary.
Okay.
And particularly some of the women that I got to know that had more of a challenging experience, growing up in New York, let's say.
Yeah.
I think that something about portraiture can transmit a little bit of your story without having to spell it out, super overtly.
Yeah.
And I think that came through in some cases. But everybody's an individual. Everybody has their own story, and I think that the biggest challenge is capturing and honoring like the individual and their beauty for who they are as that unique and distinct person, but then also realizing that the overall body of work is going to stand for something else in a way, a broader picture and a bigger idea. And I think one of the things that I did know as I was pushing forward was that I hadn't really seen paintings done in this style before, of like, there was a very few, and in fact, I was pretty naive at the time. Like, I didn't even know of like Barclay Hendricks' Madonna painting. I wasn't familiar with it. So for me, like painting a woman with an afro, I really didn't have any
like reference.
Yeah, and again, like a little bit of it was not doing that much research, but at the same time, I could name one or two artists now, that were doing that. So it was still pretty rare. And so there was a lot of, walking a fine line, like for myself, as being Japanese Canadian and growing up with a very diverse group of friends. It was very organic. Again, I didn't think too much about the juxtaposition being, in a way, a statement in and of itself. I've always looked at things with kind of a worldview, and so it's that shift between getting real specific and being, in the space with somebody, and then like looking at the bigger picture and just sort of thinking of humanity. And I've always been very connected with that because of that, I think, very diverse group of friends, because my parents were, quote unquote interracial marriage, and they had to overcome a lot of obstacles. My father's family history dealt with Japanese internment camps, and my mother's family history dealt with her father being in World War II, where the Japanese were an arch enemy, and a lot of issues that came out of that. So there was a lot of conflict, I think, and contrast. But also my parents were very open and accepting of everyone, I think, because of their experience, and they transmitted that onto me. So I didn't feel separations, which growing up in Canada, other than, we had, actually, as a child, the first time you're identified as being somebody different is it's a heartbreaking moment. And I'm getting emotional thinking about it, but so I had my incidences where it's like, oh wait, okay, so being different is a problem, and so I can kind of relate to that idea of discrimination a little bit. And then friends of mine who were like from Trinidad and Jamaica and whatnot, especially my friends from Trinidad, like they got bullied so hard. And so you start to realize that it is a thing for people, like based on the color of your skin, like this is a thing for people that they're gonna, and the problem is like, it's, the problem is the kids that are saying that stuff would never say that if somebody didn't teach them wrong, but to circle back to what I was saying, I think that there was always this kind of worldview for me, and this idea of like, even from a young age, like we're all just human, and we should, get to know each other's stories and experience each other's culture. We should, as I became more committed to being an artist, I was like, yeah, absolutely, we should draw and paint and film each other and photograph each other, and and really share things and explore each other's stories to the best that we can, without ever saying like, I'm an expert on what this person's experience is. No, but I'm going to do my best to try to document, what I see or what I know of this person in the most sort of respectful, kind of uplifting way that I can. So that's kind of how I've always operated. And unfortunately, this day and age, not everybody like sees things through that same
not
prism,
at all.
you know. Yeah, some people are like everything that they're taking in, you know, has a filter, and sometimes, unfortunately, very negative. But you know, overall, for me, the work has been so rewarding on so many different levels, and not just for myself. You know, like I say, I think when you realize it's sort of a calling, it's not really that important what people think of me, you know, at the end of the day, or what they say to me. You know, it's what's important is creating the work and having the work sort of live and breathe and exist out there in the world on its own.
Right.
And so that's really the overriding thing that I've always had as motivation.